Hey, greetings. Thanks for joining me today. This is Fred in Alaska. It's a little too cold to be out in the Tahoe, so I got to tolerate potentially my dogs getting in my face, but that's no big deal. What I'm sharing with you today comes pre-statehood, 1957 to be exact. So what Herbie shared with me, it was really rough for him because he was 10 years old at the time. So he was from the village he's from, which he didn't want to get into or whatever. He had to leave due to his father's alcoholism after World War II. He gets sent off to his uncle's house, which he lived with his aunt and uncle through high school and stuff. But he would they lived in what is now near what's known as Iditirod, right? It wasn't the name of the place back then. However, when he gets there, it was a rough transition because he went from just rough, chaotic stuff to stability, which was hard for him to get used to from what he was saying. But one of the things he enjoyed is his uncle enjoyed getting out into the woods. Got my dog eating kibble off camera, so if you hear crunching, it's just Tank. Anyway, so love to adventure. Well, his uncle, he had gotten back from doing chores with his older cousin, which was 14, and his uncle just got done talking to a neighbor about something to do with some rocks. He suspected potentially a gold claim or something like that, right? Just really random in nature, but it was an adventure, and his uncle was all for trying to get a leg up, you know, go gold mining or whatever, look for gold, pay dirt, whatever. Again, he's 10 years old, and so he's getting bits and pieces of it and doesn't truly understand what's going on. Where they were was south of where Iditirod is now. I'll pull up the map for that so you guys can get a better idea. So he said when they left, him and his cousin were the worker bees. That's pretty standard stuff as native kids. You're doing the work. And anyway, so him and his cousin load up the skiff. The skiff was like a 20-foot, real narrow, all handmade, and it had an old car motor for the motor in it, right? And real just slapped together, but it worked. And his uncle was proud of his contraption and tried to use it any time he could, you know, outside of wintertime. Well, from what he said, they left, and it wasn't all that long that it took to travel to this spot. They stopped a couple places and set a net for whitefish just to have food on the trip because his uncle only brought some beans and stuff, right? Anyway, so they get to where they were going to walk along this bluff. And according to what he was saying, his uncle's friend, neighbor, told him along that bluff he had found some gold nuggets. And, you know, if he was really wanting to try to get a leg up, to go there, and that's the place to go, right? And his uncle's just going on a whim, basically. Hey, yeah, let's go on an adventure. It was just getting into fall. You know, the leaves are starting to turn and everything. And so crisp morning, you know, the first morning after they set up camp. And for the first few days, it was no problem. They were going approximately maybe 1,000, 1,500 feet from their camp, walking along this bluff, just stopping periodically and checking out the ground, you know, seeing how much overburden there was, how much dirt on top, and basically just digging around, seeing what kind, if they find quartz or any other kind of leading rocks, right? So he said he was just doing his thing, being a kid. You know, he's 10 years old. He's looking at the birds. He's, you know, doing kid stuff. You know, he had a little 22, you know, for shooting spruce grouse or maybe a rabbit or something like that. Because, again, they only brought some beans. And so they only caught a few whitefish on the way down. And so, you know, basically, hey, his uncle tells him, I'm going to be digging around, you and your cousin. You guys shoot spruce chickens or whatever, make sure we have something at the end of every day to eat. So he was doing his thing. And he said it was about 3 days into this that early in the morning he had gotten up and he had to use the restroom outside. And when he got up, he heard a howling way off in the distance. Didn't really, he just figured wolves, no big deal, you know, there's wolves around. And at that time, his uncle was getting up and heard the wolves too, right? And so he's going back into this makeshift shelter. I wouldn't call it a tent, old school canvas tarp, and you know, his uncle had made a little portable wood stove out of some old small oil can of some kind. He said it had to have been like a 20-ish gallon oil can, but his uncle had fabricated him a little wood stove, right, and used some old exhaust pipe from an old vehicle for the stovepipe. And again, uncle was all about making stuff himself, you know what I mean? So everything was improvised. And he's in there feeding this stove, and his uncle comes back in, and it was Herbie's job to basically cook breakfast, get breakfast going. And once they got there, they had always had beans on the stove, so there was always beans ready. It's just what are we having with the beans kind of thing, right? Well, he gets dressed and he goes out looking for spruce chickens, and he's unsuccessful. He comes back because they're about to start this work day where they're basically adventuring, checking out the area. He said they got to a spot further down the bluff, the furthest they've gotten from camp, and that's when it was mid-morning, and they heard the loudest howling he said he had ever heard in his life, a wolf howl. He said it sounded like a wolf, but it was so loud, it sounded like a wolf on a bullhorn. It was very powerful, very loud. And immediately him and his cousin were scared. Now his cousin was 14, just a few years older, but of course a little bigger at that age. And his cousin had a 30-06 rifle. He had his little 22, and his uncle also had a 30-06 rifle. Always had them with them because, you know, there's bears out there, you know. And anyway, so the digging that they were, and grant you, this wasn't full-blown mining. They were just digging a little bit, checking the area. That it was an adventure. It wasn't like a full-blown mining program, you know. They were just out there to check it out. He said his uncle, once the howling stopped, tells the boys, gather up your stuff. Well, the boys, all they were carrying was shovels. One shovel, he had a small pick, and their firearms and a couple extra, you know, ammo in their pockets. They weren't, but his uncle was so focused, he was telling them basically, have your stuff together, we gotta go. They didn't see, him and his cousin did not see what his uncle initially saw, because he was looking up the bank off to the right, just off away from them, where that sound was originating. So they're ready to go. They tell him, hey, yeah, you know, we're good to go. And uncle starts telling them to start walking back. Now, they get about 10 feet, Herbie said, and that's when a few rocks, pump, hit the ground real hard. He said they had to have been thrown with force, and they're kind of looking around, and his uncle says, run. So they're confused. He said, run, Jakayuk, run. There's a Jakayuk up there, a monster, right? And they take off running. Because at this point, this thing was just above them on the bluff. They didn't see it initially, right? So they're retreating back to their camp, which, again, 1,000 feet, a little more. Yeah, I mean, not that far in the big scheme of things. Because they're running... On the map, it's kind of hard to see, but they were up on a little shelf that was up a little higher than the river before the bluff started. So they're going along, and all they had to go by was game trails, old game trails and whatnot, right? It wasn't a well-traveled area. So they're busting through, and once they got about half the distance, he said, from where the initial rock throwing started, that's when he heard his uncle firing. Bam, bam. He said he unloaded his rifle and was, because when they heard the shots, they turned around to look. They couldn't see what his uncle was seeing firing the rounds, right? He shot 4 or 5 times, had the bolt open on his 30-06, and he's telling them, run, get to camp, you know? And he's reloading his rifle. They get about half the distance from where his uncle started shooting the first time, and more shots pop off. And after the second volley of gunfire, they heard this hellacious screaming. He said it sounded like a demon coming out of the woods. That's when him and his cousin first got a look at the hairy man, right? He said it was real lanky and skinny. It was very tall, but it looked weird because it looked like its torso was the longest part, along with its arms, and his legs didn't seem to be all that long from their vantage point, right? And so he, being so young, didn't understand. He wasn't understanding what he was seeing at the time, he said. He said he was really confused because to him, it looked like a skinny man in a fur coat, and he didn't know why his uncle was trying to shoot this skinny man in a fur coat, right? And he, at the time, being 10, he knew it was large, but he didn't realize how large, right? So they get back to camp, and the screaming's going on still, just off, out of sight, and the uncle's keeping watch, and they're trying to get everything done, unpacked, you know, all that stuff. The stove was still hot from the morning, so him and his cousin drug it outside. They dump all the coals out of it and set it off to the side and kind of stomp on all the coals that were left just to get them out of the way. And they start taking down this canvas tarp that they had set up. Meanwhile, the whole time his uncle's telling them to hurry, cut the lines, don't save the rope, just cut the lines, get our stuff, you know. And so he's 10, his cousin 14, they're doing their damnedest. And his uncle was always kind, always quick to laugh, liked to joke around, wasn't a mean guy, but he was very, very serious. You hurry up, hurry. First time he heard his uncle cuss, you know, yelling at him to move their asses, to get the shit and get moving. So they gather it up. They at some point his uncle turns around and gives them instruction on what to bring. Leave that, take this, take that, and leave this stuff. I'll get it later or whatever. So they end up leaving that canvas tarp and a couple other things, nothing too major, a kerosene lamp or something. And they grab the most important stuff, and him and his cousin are going along back down to the skiff, and the uncle's right there watching. Meanwhile, this whole time, this hairy man's just out of sight, screaming, breaking stuff. Periodically, grass stumps and stuff would fly by. Just demonic sounds that he had never heard before, and it really, really freaked him out. So they get down to the skiff, and at that point, they're getting the stuff in the skiff, and his cousin has to keep watch while his uncle fires up that homemade contraption of a motor. It was an old motor out of a car. It had it flooded a lot. It had its problems, right? So the uncle sat there for almost an hour, and cousin keeping an eye out. Uncle was real nervous, looking around all the time. Finally got it started, and they started, and they got out of there. One thing that Herbie said that he'll never forget is when he saw it as they were leaving the riverbank. He said he never seen something look at him with so much hate. You know, because in him and his uncle's eyes and his cousin's eyes, they weren't doing anything. This thing started chucking rocks, dangerously chucking rocks at them. He found out later that the two rocks that impacted him and his cousin were almost hit by these rocks, and they were kids. They weren't paying attention to up the hill. They were paying attention to the path that they had to take, and the rocks just came in just behind them both, and they heard them impact. But he found that out later. He didn't realize how much danger they were in until the shots fired. And he said the expression on this thing's face was just one of just hate. He said he's dealt with hate in his life, and he's never seen that kind of scowl. He said this creature had real light complexion, almost like a white man. However, the difference being is the shape of the head was different. Real big head, real wide jaw, real big nose, bulbous at the tip, and that was the things that stood out the most to him. And the eyes, he said, he just saw nothing but blackness. He couldn't make out the eyes. And again, this comes from approximately 1957, pre-statehood. He said that once they got back to the village, his uncle had a powwow with his friend and some other stuff. And he said it was like a week later, they attempted, him and his friend and a couple other adults, not kids this time, had gone back. And from what he heard, there was nothing left of the tarp. It was shred to bits. And whatever else was there was just destroyed. But I want to thank Herbie for having the patience. I've been trying to incorporate these maps, so and thank you to his granddaughter for helping him, because he's not, you know, he's not hip to technology, far less than me, and I'm not very good at it. But I appreciate his patience. I want to thank his granddaughter. She knows who she is. Herbie, I appreciate you sharing that with us. And let's see, happy late Merry Christmas, yada yada, all that happy crap. I don't celebrate it myself, but thank you guys for joining me, and we will catch you guys on the next one.